It was a few years ago that Marilee and I went to New York City for the first time. We've always traveled through by airplane, but never stopped and soaked up the city. And we got a boat, rented one of those boats with a bunch of other people, and we went out and took a tour of the rivers and the harbor. And we were going out towards the Statue of Liberty. And how many have done that? It's really emotional. And it made me really stop and really reflect deeply on the importance of liberty in our nation, how much of core value it really is, and furthermore, how responsible we are to maintaining that liberty, to be responsible to one another in an unselfish way. And I thought, what a privilege it is to have their governor, their former governor, to come and speak to us, who has had a wonderful experience, truly the American dream. His grandparents came over to this country and ultimately settled in upstate New York, in Peekskill, New York, on a farm, and where his parents and he were raised. And then, as you can imagine, he went on, he got his education, he did well, he went to college, got a law degree, but he came back and he went to work in his community, being involved in city politics, and while working, and so he and his family are the classic example of a family sacrifice, public service dedication, which, by the way, is a high calling, and then finally living your dream. So off he went. From there, he served several terms as assemblyman, and then went on to 3 terms as governor. Now I'm going to turn on my iPad here, and there's a couple of things that are really fun here. George's mother was quite remarkable, as most moms are. She turned down a college education to help fund his education. He did his part, but she did an incredible part in all that. And I think that's another part of the American story. We help each other. After graduation, he went into a practice of law, and then as he served 3 terms as governor, which he won, as you can see, winning 3 times tells you a lot about a person and their maturity, their ability to respect and honor people, even with opposing views, while at the same time helping to form healthy public policy. And he'll probably tell you a little bit more about that, so I won't go into all the details. He is married to Libby, and I think what's most notable about this marriage is they met while body surfing in a hurricane. I don't think I've ever met anybody that did that. I've heard people describe they'd been in a hurricane after they got married, but maybe what it was a metaphor for being able to get in the hurricane of public policy. The other thing that I really love, I want to tell you about his kids. They have 4, Emily, Teddy, Allison, Owen, and of course 2 dogs named Balto and Bradley. Emily is a former attorney currently focusing on raising her children. Teddy served as a Marine officer in Iraq and works for the Knights of Columbus and is a father. Allison is a historical fiction novelist at the New York Times, best-selling author. The one book, is The Trader's Wife, and the other is The Accidental Empress. And their youngest son, Owen, is an Army officer who recently returned from Afghanistan and will attend grad school for film. So with that, I would like to welcome you, Governor. Please come, and we look forward.
Thank you, Bob.
We look forward to the wisdom and encouragement of your service. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'll tell you, I'm far more proud of my 4 kids than of anything I ever did. So you're mentioning them. really makes me proud. And I just have to correct one thing. You mentioned my daughter, Allison, had 2 New York Times bestsellers. She now has 3 New York Times bestsellers. The third one, The Empress on Her Own, just came out. So not that I'm bragging or proud, but you can claim a little credit for that, because their mother, my wife, actually lived for 3 years and went to junior high school when her father was at Fort Larson Air Force Base on Moses Lake, which is, I guess, only about an hour from here. So, and she always told me how beautiful central and eastern Washington was, except in the winter when it was cold and she had to walk to junior high school. But I had a chance to drive over from Seattle this morning with Susan Hutchison, the Republican Party state chair, and I have to tell you, it is absolutely beautiful here. This is a beautiful state. This is an incredible state. It is a very diverse state with great cities, great mountains, and tremendous farm country, and you should all be very proud to be residents of the great state of Washington. I had the chance to speak a little over a year ago at the Policy Solutions Summit in Seattle. Did any of you hear that speech? A few of you did. Don't worry, I don't remember a thing I said. So whatever I'm going to say will probably be completely different. And I had a great speech already. I was all torqued up. And then I heard that Congressman Nethercutt gave a brilliant speech on civility this morning. You know, the last thing in the world you want is a New Yorker speaking after an effective speech on civility. So I had to throw out most of my political lines and try to just deliver things straight. So here goes. But in seriousness, Dan and Chris said they wanted me to talk about my experience in New York, where New York was when I started, and where we got to, and the solutions as to how we were able to do that. And I'd love to have a lot of Q&A, so I'll try to get through that as quickly as possible so that we can do any questions you have. And you know, you think of New York today, and it's booming, the state is doing well, young people from all over the country want to be there. It wasn't like that when I ran for governor. When I ran for governor, New York had the highest tax burden in America, but it also had the lowest credit rating in America and was absolutely broke. We were dead last in private sector jobs. There was no state in America that had failed to create or lost more private sector jobs than the state of New York. And not only did we have the highest tax burden, we had the lowest credit rating of any state in America. And when I took office, I inherited a $5 billion deficit at a time when $1 billion was a lot of money. To make matters worse, we had the highest rate of violent crime of any state in America. And 1 in 11 of every resident of the state, every man, woman, and child, 1 in 11 of every one of them was on welfare. Not Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security, disability, welfare. It was a failing state by any possible measure of success. And yet, the Republican Party, and I'm not going to be partisan this afternoon, but I'm a Republican and I was running as a Republican. The election right before the time I ran, the Republican had gotten 21% of the vote. You know, obviously not a very successful campaign. So I decided, this kid from Peekskill, New York, who had never raised more than $35,000 for a campaign in his life, that I was going to run against the mighty Mario Cuomo and change New York. And as Bob pointed out, I managed to do that. And the question is, how and what were the solutions? Because the Washington Policy Center is all about solutions and how you get things done. Well, the first thing you need to do is know where you want to go. And that sounds pretty simple, but in politics, how often have you heard someone running for office saying, this is where I want us to be in 4 years. This is what I want us to achieve. You always hear about the problems. You always hear about how horrible the other candidate is. How often do you hear, this is where I want us to be? So what I did is I laid out that vision. You know, I wanted us to be a state where we were leading the country in tax cuts instead of high taxes. I wanted to be a state where we were leading the nation in private sector job creation instead of loss of jobs. I wanted us to be a state where we were leading the nation in getting people off the welfare rolls and onto the employment rolls instead of leading the country in welfare dependency. You have to know where you want to go if you're going to have any chance of getting there. So I laid out that roadmap during the campaign, and enough people said, that makes sense. We are failing. And it's not because of any inherent failing of our state or our people. It's because the political leadership are great at pointing out problems and demonizing each other, but no one's offered solutions. Now I'm hearing a solution. So then I got elected, and then came the hard part. How do you actually do it? Well, the answer is there's no one path. If you know where you want to go, you have to look to use whatever means, legal, ethical means at your disposal you have to achieve that goal. One of the cornerstones of what I said I was going to do is I was going to cut income tax across the board by at least 25% for every single person paying taxes in New York. And by the way, Dan, you were talking how one of your fights is against having an income tax in Washington State. Don't ever let the state have an income tax. They'll tell you it's only going to be 1%. It's only going to be on people who make $11 billion a year. And the minute the foot gets in the door, it just is an opening that never ceases to get wider. So I ran saying, I'm going to cut taxes across the board. Nobody believed I'd do it. And then as I took office, we were hit with this $5 billion deficit. And everybody said, well, you can't do it now. How do you cut taxes when the state was broke? The answer to that is pretty simple. Governments are always broke. They're continually demanding more money from the private sector and from people because the demands for government services or government grants are endless. It is an infinite game, where as long as they can take money from those who produce it and give it to those who vote, if they can get away with it, they're going to. So I said, no, yes, it's going to be hard to cut a budget to cut taxes with a $5 billion deficit, but it makes it more important because we have to send a message to the people who create the jobs and pay the taxes that we're serious, and they're going to have a chance to succeed competitively, even if they're in New York State. So I put together a budget that cut pretty much everything. I'm proud to be a very green Republican governor. I did a lot of environmental things, and we had an environmental fund. I abolished the environmental fund. I was proud to be a governor who appreciated the importance of arts in New York State, economically and culturally. I abolished the arts funding. This is all I proposed. I proposed raising tuition. I proposed cutting the state government, every single agency, by at least 3%. And I had a state assembly, by the way, that had 103 Democrats and 47 Republicans, mostly New York City liberal Democrats. So I put that out, and I provoked, I don't think in the history of the state there's ever been as many protesters. Everywhere I went, there were thousands of protesters. I remember I went out to Montana from New York. I had protesters in Montana who had followed me from New York. They were the politest protesters I've ever seen in my life, unlike some of the New York protesters. But it's part of democracy. And if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. So I had these protesters everywhere, and I just say, I understand. I understand you don't want this cut. I understand you don't want that cut. But it's all about you. It's about you having a job. You're concerned that you're not going to be getting this or that. I'm more concerned about your company moving to Texas or North Carolina and you having to go with them. I remember I went to our state universities where I proposed raising the tuition, and we had literally a riot at one of the state universities where I was trying to speak, and I did speak. And they were all going nuts, how can you do this? And I said the same thing. I want you to get a great education. But when you get that education, I don't want you to take it someplace else in the country. I want you to be able to find a job in this community, in the state you came from, somewhere in this state. So we had this enormous battle, but I made it plain, quite plain to the legislative leaders. There would be no budget, none, until they passed essentially what I proposed. And we had an April 1st fiscal year. April 1st came, we weren't even close. May 1st came, we weren't even close. June 1st came, we weren't even close. The press was killing me. There's no budget. what they didn't understand is that when there's no budget, the state can act under temporary bills that are only allowed to be proposed under the Constitution by the governor. So every week, I would propose a 2-week bill that encompassed a number of the changes that I thought were necessary to accomplish the goal that I'd laid out for the people of the state. And if they didn't pass them, the government would shut down. And finally, by the middle of August, they surrendered and said, this guy's crazy, but he's absolutely serious. If we ever want to have a budget, if we ever want to get out of here, we're going to have to pass essentially his budget. And I will never forget listening to the debate in my office as the Assembly were passing my budget with all the tax cuts, and the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee there going, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. This is going to destroy the state. The governor is completely out of his mind. We will have to undo all the damage he is proposing. I vote yes. Yeah. And it was a very rewarding moment. So the point on this, and we got it done, the point on this is that you have to know where you're going, where you're trying to get to, and you have to be willing to use any legal, ethical, moral tactic you have to get there. You cannot say, well, it's hard. We're not going to continue. We're not going to be able to get it done. And we did. And by the way, it included a mandatory reform of the welfare system where the able-bodied had to work before it had been passed by the federal government. It included a complete changing of the criminal justice system from top to bottom, including the death penalty for those who killed a cop during the act of a robbery. It encompassed virtually every one of the reforms to improve the state that I believed were necessary. So we were going to change the economic climate. Tax cuts were a critical part of it, but you also have to balance the budget. And I remember environmental groups coming to me saying, what's going on? You're the green guy here. You're a great Republican. And my son named Teddy is named after Teddy Roosevelt, one of my heroes. And I go, yeah, but we're broke. And when you don't have the money, you can't spend it even if you want to. And I remember the same thing with the Arts Council. And they're saying, you know, you've always been supportive of the arts in New York. And I did the same thing. Yeah, we're broke. And I remember a typical group of left-wing actors and actresses, Susan Sarandon and the rest, come up to meet with me. And they're taking my head off. And one of them is Christopher Reeve, who was a wonderful human being who played Superman. And they left after taking my head off. And I said the same thing. We're broke. We're not going to spend money. And just to give you an example of civility and how gracious some people can be, about an hour later, I got a knock on my door, and my secretary opened the door, and it was Christopher Reeve. And he came back in, and he goes, I want to apologize for them. You know, I'm very strongly pro-arts. I know you're broke. If there's anything you can do this year or next year, I'm sure we'd all appreciate it. So even when you are fighting a fight and the other side doesn't understand where you're coming from, if you're respectful and willing to listen, you can lay the foundation to achieve common ground going forward. But as any of you here who runs a small business or a large business knows, it's not just taxes, it's regulations. So another thing I did in that first week was we said, we're going to create a new office. And it sounds kind of counterintuitive. Government's too big and you're going to have a new office. Well, we call it the Office of Regulatory Reform. In that office, I gave the power to accept, reject, or modify any proposed new regulation coming from any agency of the state government. If the environmental agency wanted to impose a new regulation, it had to be approved by my regulatory reform. If the tax department wanted the regulation, it had to go through where they would do an intensive cost-benefit analysis. And by the way, they not only had the power to approve or reject new regulations, I gave them the authority to go through every single regulation already on the books, to repeal or modify those regulations, doing a cost-benefit analysis that had never been done. And by the end, they had repealed over 3,000 regulations that had been on the books that were just impeding businesses and making it hard to grow jobs in New York State. Lower the tax burden, lower the regulatory burden, change the economic climate. But the other thing we had to do financially was then balance the books. So we took enormous measures to reduce the size of the state government. And I remember calling in my commissioners and saying, you know, the budget has proposed cuts of 3% for every agency. And some of the commissioners were going, I can't do that. It's going to kill the agency. And I said, totally understand. That's okay. I'll find someone who can. And you'd be amazed at how quickly they said, well, let me take another look. And I didn't just say cut 3. I said cut 6%. Show me 3, show me 6. Because some we might only cut 1 or 2, and some we might cut 5 or 6. And by the time we got through the exercise where they knew that this wasn't a suggestion, this is something they had to do, we were able to dramatically reduce the size and the cost of the state agencies so that while cutting taxes, we were cutting expenditures, and at the end, we had multiple billions in surplus and the highest credit rating in the state's history. And one of the things I did is, and it's the same thing, you know where you're going to go, you have to have a solution. Day one, I enacted by executive order a hard hiring freeze. No state agency could hire anybody without the approval of my budget office. And it was very successful. We wanted to reduce the size of the government and the workforce through attrition. We did. It worked extremely well. We needed to do more besides just reduction through attrition. So I sat down with the legislature and we passed legislation providing early retirement incentives for people to leave government, but only if the position was abolished. You were not eligible unless it was abolished. And by the end of that, my 12 years as governor, we had reduced the size of the state workforce by, I think, 27,000 workers, over 15%. We had had almost no layoffs. And again, you need to balance the budget. You take the measures, put in place the policies, and get it done. I'll just tell you one story. The Democrats had controlled New York State government for a long, long time. And they were stunned that all of a sudden this crazy farm guy from Peekskill, New York, was the governor, was going to fire them all and change everything. So they found they tried to make everybody they could protected by civil service. So they gave all these people civil service titles and positions and everything so that I didn't have the discretion to remove them. Then some clever bureaucrat who was working for the state and had nothing to do going through the law found this obscure law that if you were a volunteer firefighter, you couldn't be laid off by the state of New York. Weird law, but it was there. So after November 8th, when I got elected, and before January 1st, you'd be amazed at the number of state workers who had discovered it was their lifelong dream to be a volunteer firefighter. So they couldn't get laid off. So I inherit this enormous government bureaucracy. People are volunteer firefighters. I can't touch them. People have civil service. I can't touch them. They have no interest in moving my agenda forward at all. How do you get things done? Well, I remember sitting down with my team and, we can't lay this one off, we can't lay those off. And we had another economic issue, workers' compensation. The costs were through the roof. It was utterly absurd. And we changed the law, but we also had to change the bureau and the board members and everything. We had this horrible workers' compensation office that was just giving everybody ridiculous benefits if they had their fingernail hurt while having a beer at lunch in a restaurant, and the employer had to pay. That's a slight exaggeration. So this horrible office in Brooklyn, and I go, we got to disrupt this office. And they go, well, you can't. They're all civil service. They're all protected. None of them can go. We're sitting around thinking, I go, yeah, we can't lay them off. But we can move the office from Brooklyn to Buffalo. If you have spent your whole life living in Brooklyn, and all of a sudden your office is moving to Buffalo, an early retirement incentive seems like a very attractive option. So we moved the office to Buffalo. Most of the people left, and we were able to carry out our agenda. So the point I want to make here, and let me just repeat, the most important part is you have to know where you want to get to. And that's one of the reasons why the Washington Policy Center is so important, because you lay out solutions. You lay out where you want to get to. You lay out not just things where you're playing defense, like we're not going to have an income tax or a capital gains tax in the state of Washington, and you're absolutely right. but you also outline solutions like how do we enhance public school and education in the state. We're going to have charter schools. And when they put up a roadblock through using the Supreme Court, we're going to go back to the people, fix the challenges, and do it again, and we're going to have charter schools. That's exactly what you have to do. You have to know what you want to accomplish. You have to be relentless in the drive to accomplish it, and make sure, if it's important enough, that you're going to do everything in your power to achieve it. And let me just tell you my charter school story. I wanted to, part of improving our economic climate and our quality of life was to enhance education in New York State. We spent a fortune, but too many schools were failing. And one of the solutions would be charter schools. No one wanted charter schools. This is very early on before many states had it. The Democrats didn't want it. Oh, the teachers union hate it. We're going to be taking money from the public schools and giving it to rich kids and private hedge fund guys to run their own play school. You never can get it done. The Republicans didn't want it because they were largely New York suburban based. And all the suburban school boards were going, oh, I don't want a charter school competing with our public school. It's going to take resources from the public school. No one wanted it, but I wanted it. And I was waiting for the appropriate moment to try to get it. And the New York State Constitution says that the legislature can vote itself a pay raise only when there's an intervening election, meaning that only every 2 years after the election, before the next legislature takes session, can they vote themselves a pay raise. And for years, they had been talking to me, can we do a pay raise? No. Can we do a pay raise? No. Can we do a pay raise? No. So finally, they come to me and say, we're going to do a pay raise. And I go, well, I'm not for it. And they go, we have bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats. We're going to do a pay raise because you will not veto it, because you are going to tick off everybody in the legislature, including your friends in the Republican Party. And I go, you can pass it. I'm going to veto it. And they just said, well, you're not going to. We know that. They passed the law. And the governor has 10 days to sign or veto the legislation. And they say, well, we passed it. You know, you have to sign it. You know, nobody in the legislature will ever speak to you again if you don't sign it. And I go, I'm not signing it. And I said, by the way, I will sign it, but you have to pass my charter school bill. And they go, none of us want charter schools. And I go, no, and I don't want a pay raise. You pass the charter school bill, I'll sign the pay raise bill and take the heat for it. No, not a chance. 7 days go by, 8 days go by, 9 days go by, not going to sign it, no talk, we'll never pass a charter school bill. 10th day, midnight at 11:59 of the 10th day, I'm going to veto the bill. And I know what's going to happen, which is that the legislative leaders, the speaker and the majority leader, are going to come down to my office and say, hey, please, we got to work this out here. And so I left the Capitol. Sure enough, shortly after I leave the Capitol, the speaker and the majority leader come down. Where's the governor? Oh, he's not here. Well, we got to meet with him. Well, he's not here. They call me, they get me on the phone and say, you know, all right, we'll do something, but you have to weaken the charter school bill. You have to make enormous changes to the charter school bill. And I go, no, I'm not going to talk. And they go, well, let's negotiate it. And I go, no. A horrible breach of protocol. And they go, well, that's it. You know, we're never going to get your charter school bill, and you veto the pay raise. You know, you'll be hated. Around 6 o'clock at night, they call me again. No, I'm not going to do anything. Around 8 o'clock at night, they say, okay, we're willing to talk about passing the charter school bill with a couple of amendments. And so what I did is a breach of protocol. The governor meets with the speaker and the majority leader, not staff. I say I'm sending over a low counsel to meet with you guys because I was so upset. So the counsel is in the room, and they go and calls me back around 11 o'clock and goes, they have 11 changes, you know, they want to make to the charter school bill. And I had put in a provision that I knew was impossible for them to accept, that I didn't need. And it's about 11 o'clock at night. This council calls me and goes, they have these 11 changes. And I go, no, yes. So he takes it back to the speaker, and around 11:30, not a chance, you know, we're not going to do it. 11:50, I get a call. We're passing the charter school bill on the floor of the legislature right now, please sign the pay raise. So we have in New York State one of the best charter school laws in the United States, and I'm sure with the Policy Center and your support and the public support for that referendum, now Washington is going to have a great charter school program in Washington State as well. So I'd love to do questions. The point, very simply, is that you can always get things done. You just have to be tenacious, understand where you want to go, and continue to have a dialogue constantly with people even with whom you might disagree. So I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you. And now, Dan, if you want to do, or Chris, you want to do Q&A, I'm happy to answer anything you might have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, we do have time for questions, and Maggie's right there in the red in the middle, so raise your hand and she'll come bring the microphone to you.
Hi, Governor. Ron Valencia.
Yeah.
My question is, how much of an impediment was the public sector unions in New York during these changes?
It was very difficult. You know, they were not exactly big fans. In fact, when I was in Montana, it was the public employees of Montana that had been called by the public employees of New York to picket me. But, you know, I always maintained civility. I always would meet with them. In fact, when there were protesters, I'd go over and shake hands and say, you know, we disagree, but you have a right under our great system of freedom to picket me and to say these things, but I'm working to try to find common ground. I never demonized the workers, because the workers were great. It was the union leadership that I had difficulties with, and you just fight the fight. And I had years where there was no contract, where they had no contract for a year or two at a time. And I remember one of my State of the State speeches in the state capitol. It was the second largest protest in the history of the state capitol. There were probably 25,000 people circling the Capitol with signs and everything. And it's kind of like the Russian Revolution, where you have all these people on the streets outside, and you have all these people with suits inside this magnificent state assembly chamber, and you can hear the screams and yells outside, but you just ignore it. You know, you always engage in a dialogue, treat people respectfully so long as they obey the law. And they were a very difficult impediment. The teachers union hated the charter school bill. The public employee unions disliked most of what I did. But you can always find a way. And I'll just give you one example of working with the public employee unions. You know, I didn't want to lay people off, but I was going to reduce the size of the workforce. And I just said, you know, we're broke. We're going to do this. And they said, well, you know, we don't think you're right. And I said, well, let's sit down and work cooperatively. And we did things like the early retirement incentive. But another thing we did is they had different union rules where, for example, you were a design engineer in the highway department that didn't need a design engineer, but there was a design engineer vacancy in the conservation department. You couldn't move that person. You had to hire somebody else. So I was able to negotiate with them changing the work rules so that you could shift people across departments when there was a vacancy instead of having to lay people off. So we had our battles. They ran their ads, but ultimately we were able to get things done.
What's your take on the national presidential election?
Did you hear that? I couldn't hear that question.
What's your take on the national presidential elections?
That's this year? You know, I mean, this is just such a predictable, bland year. I mean, I don't know why anybody's all excited about it. Let me try to give you an honest answer. Everybody talks about how the Republican Party has this problem because of Donald Trump. It's not the Republican Party, and it's not Donald Trump. There is an enormous feeling of anger towards Washington, that our government is out of control and doesn't represent the American people. And it's not just in the Republican Party. It's why Bernie Sanders just won his 20th primary against Hillary Clinton. because across the spectrum, Democrats and Republicans feel, as I do, not just disappointed in Washington, but angry about Washington. It is not a government of the people of America. You go to Washington, and it's like being on a foreign planet. So Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders has tapped into that legitimate anger. And that's what, and the other part is it's not just anger towards Washington, it's anger towards politicians. The voter takes a look and says, everybody promises everything. They're going to do this, they're going to do that. They get elected, nothing changes. Both parties. The Republicans gain the House, they're going to repeal Obamacare, there's no repeal of Obamacare. The Democrats are going to do this, nothing ever changes. So you have enormous anger towards Washington and enormous anger towards politicians, which is why Donald Trump on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side have done so incredibly well. The problem is anger is not a policy. And ultimately, I think, to win the election, Donald Trump has to not just capture that anger, which I feel as well, and I think a majority of the American people feel, but also convince people that he will channel that into policies that they agree with and that will work for the American people. And it was interesting, I was reading a poll on the way over from Seattle, and for the first time ever in an American election, a majority of Americans dislike both candidates. And Hillary Clinton is a brutally flawed candidate. 56% of Americans don't like her, 60% of Americans don't like Donald Trump, and more than a quarter of Americans don't like either one of them. So, and that's where the election is going to be decided, not by the people who like Hillary, not by the people who like Trump, but by the people who don't like either one of them. And I don't think the way to accomplish that is by attacking someone who's already disliked. I think the way is to lay out a series of policies that the American people can say, yes, that's what we need to solve the problems. Exactly what you're talking about, solutions. We haven't heard solutions. The candidate who is able to capture that vote of those who don't particularly like them, but believe in their solutions, I think will win the election. And I'll tell you, how I was able to win as a Republican in New York, it was not just about the solution. It was about how you express the solution. I remember talking about crime and speaking at a historic African-American church, the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, and saying, if you live on Fifth Avenue, if you go to work in a limousine, if you have a doormat, you don't have to worry about violent crime. They can be liberals. They don't care if the criminal's out on the street because they're safe. It's people in Harlem. It's people coming home after working the 4 to 12 shift. It's the small abogado owner who's the victim of violent crime. And we're changing these laws not for the people on Fifth Avenue in their limousines. We're changing these laws so you can be safe in every single community across New York State. When I talked about reforming welfare and requiring work, I didn't say too many people are freeloading or cheating the system. I didn't say it's costing the taxpayers too much money. What I said is too many good people who want to live the American dream are trapped in a system the left has created where people make an economic choice where they're better off dependent on government than taking that first job up the ladder of economic opportunity. And what we as a society have to do is show people that it's in their interest, it's in their family's interest to take that job so that they will become a part of the American dream instead of being dependent on this all-powerful government. So I had conservative policies, but I expressed them in ways as to how they would impact the people most impacted by them, who didn't inherently think that those were the right solutions. And that worked politically as well as governmentally. So if Donald Trump can articulate those solutions that the American people know are problems that we haven't seen, then he can win. If he doesn't do that, then I think it's going to be very difficult for him to win. You're all very polite here.
There's a question right there.
How did you overcome the gap of the public schools and the charter schools and that either perception or policy that it took away from? Because I hear that a lot, and
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, how do we overcome the the question, the challenge that you're taking from the public schools to create charter schools. First, charter schools are public schools, and that's what we had to make the case. And parents, 1,100, I guess you said, you'd have going to charter schools here. The parents know that. They know that this is a public school. It's just one using an alternative method that gives their child a better chance. So you have to, instead of a political figure speaking, you have parents speaking out on why these charter schools are important. And then the second thing is simply what we did is we focused those charter schools in areas where the traditional public school was failing, so that it would be very hard to defend the public school. And what is always galling to me is when, and I don't mean to be political, and it's not partisan, it's ideological, if I can get away with that. When there's a failing government program, the solution of the left is to put more money into what fails, instead of shutting down what fails and trying something that actually works. And that argument, I think, works with the American people, that if this thing doesn't work, why do you keep pouring more money into it? Let's try something that does work. And one of the beauties of charter schools is that if they don't work, they get closed down. And some of the charter schools we created did not work and got closed down. And that's the way the system should work. If you're a traditional public school, they never shut down. And those children are trapped. So we were able to make the case. There was always opposition. The teachers' union always disliked it because our bill allowed for non-union charter schools. And ultimately, we were able to succeed and keep them going and got them stronger. And one of the things that I've seen, and hopefully will happen here in Washington, is as you have that success with charter schools, more and more parents become attracted to the idea, and you create the momentum where it's very hard for the forces defending a failed status quo to head off an alternative that so many people see working. So.
We're about out of time anyway, so that's great. Okay.
We're out of time. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.